Welcome, everyone. There is a terrifying pattern hidden inside historical tragedies that mainstream science completely refuses to talk about. To find its origin, we have to look past the official records, back to an era heavily scarred by the cold machinery of World War II, through a 13-month countdown where unexplained global prophecies, psychological warfare, and an ancient red-eyed entity collided at a precise set of space-time coordinates. Sit back. Close your eyes for a moment and think about the last time you crossed a massive bridge. You probably felt the slight rhythmic vibration of the concrete beneath your tires. You probably looked out at the scenery, completely taking it for granted that the thousands of tons of gleaming steel holding you above the fatal drop were completely indestructible. We all do it. We treat the physical infrastructure of our world like permanent monuments operating under a comfortable psychological illusion of absolute safety. But tonight, we are turning back the clock to a time when that illusion didn't just crack. It shattered into a million sharp, terrifying pieces. This is not a dry engineering lecture. This is a journey into a dark historical labyrinth where material science, small-town secrets, and an unprecedented wave of paranormal dread collided to alter human history forever. We are going to deconstruct the story of a tragedy that did not just tear a physical hole through a tight-knit community, it ripped open an invisible tear in the very fabric of our reality, exposing a web of chilling anomalies, shared nightmares, and a legendary entity that defied every known law of biological evolution. This is a sweeping narrative of human arrogance, cosmic warnings, and the shadowy forces that gather in the dark when our world begins to fracture. Do not skip a single second of this timeline. Listen to the cadence of my voice. Lose yourself in the heavy, brooding atmosphere. And if you want to uncover the raw, unvarnished truths behind the world's most terrifying anomalies, make sure to subscribe to this channel right now. Let us step out onto the cold steel and begin our journey. Part 1. The TNT area. Our story truly begins on a freezing moonless night in the late autumn of 1966, just outside the quiet, isolated town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. For generations, this town had rested peacefully along the banks of the winding Ohio River, its residents deeply insulated by the comforting routines of rural American life. But on this specific evening, a young couple was driving their car through an abandoned, heavily overgrown World War II military complex, known to locals simply as the TNT area. Decades earlier, this vast expanse of land had been a bustling hub of the military-industrial complex. A place where the government excavated massive underground chambers and constructed thick concrete storage bunkers shaped like ancient pagan burial mounds to hold millions of pounds of volatile explosives. When the war ended, the military packed up and vanished, leaving the concrete igloos to rot in the shadows, slowly leaking toxic industrial chemicals into the surrounding wildlife refuge. It was a classic liminal space, a scarred, forgotten wasteland where human industrial decay met wild, untamed nature. And it was precisely within this toxic sanctuary that the anomalous matrix decided to violently bleed into our world. As the couple's car meandered deeper into the darkness of the old facility, navigating the cracked asphalt and dead weeds, the atmosphere inside the vehicle suddenly shifted. The air grew heavy, thick with the sharp, metallic smell of ozone. Without warning, the car's radio died. the music cutting out instantly and replacing itself with a loud, aggressive wall of electronic white noise. The driver tapped the dashboard, thinking it was a loose wire, but then the headlights swept across the rusted ruins of an old power plant, and both of them froze, their hearts seized in their chests. There, standing amidst the shadows, was a silhouette that completely fractured standard biological science. It was a towering humanoid entity, standing between 7 and 9 feet tall. But as their eyes adjusted to the darkness, a wave of primal horror washed over them. The creature possessed no discernible head, no neck, and no face. Instead, 2 massive, self-luminous globes of intense, hypnotic crimson light glowed directly from deep within its upper chest. For a localized second, time seemed to stand completely still. The entity's eyes didn't just reflect the headlights, they burned with an internal ancient fire, projecting a profound wave of neurological manipulation directly into the witnesses' minds. In an instant, they were hit with an overwhelming sensation of vertigo, severe nausea, and a crushing sense of cosmic dread that made them feel as though the sky itself was about to fall. Panic took over. The driver slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, spinning the tires in the gravel as he desperately threw the car into reverse and tore down the narrow exit road. But the nightmare was far from over. Through the rear window, they watched in absolute disbelief as the towering silhouette unfolded a pair of massive, fabric-like wings from its back. Without making a single sound, without even flapping those dark, membrane-covered wings, the entity rose effortlessly into the air. It glided just feet above the ground, pursuing their speeding vehicle with impossible velocity, matching their speed as the speedometer climbed past 70, then 80 miles per hour. The glowing red eyes remained perfectly locked onto them through the rearview mirror, tracking their every move like a heat-seeking missile. The couple screamed, praying for the highway lights to appear, and the moment the car finally broke through the perimeter of the TNT area and hit the main road toward town, the entity suddenly veered upward into the night sky, vanishing into the black clouds as quickly as it had appeared. They arrived at the local sheriff's office, drenched in sweat, pale as ghosts, gasping for breath as they tried to put words to a horror that defied human vocabulary. This was the first official documented sighting of the anomaly the media would soon dub the Mothman. And it was merely the opening line of a terrifying 13-month chronicle of high strangeness that was secretly counting down to a catastrophic date with destiny. Part 2. The High-Frequency Matrix. If you want to understand the true architecture of an anomaly, you must realize that stories like this never remain isolated in the dark. Over the winter of 1966 and into the damp spring of 1967, the quiet, small-town equilibrium of Point Pleasant completely dissolved. The encounter in the TNT area wasn't a fluke. It was a floodgate. The local police department found itself completely inundated with hundreds of frantic calls from terrified citizens who swore they were being hunted. Seasoned outdoor hunters, clear-headed local merchants, and respected law enforcement officials all began reporting identical encounters. Groups of armed men, gripped by an absolute siege mentality, formed volunteer patrols. They loaded their shotguns, grabbed powerful spotlights, and spent their nights combing through the overgrown woods of the munitions factory, desperate to hunt down the winged anomaly and reclaim their town. But the creature seemed entirely immune to the physical rules of tracking. It would manifest instantaneously in one remote sector of the county, terrify a family inside their home, and then vanish without leaving a single footprint, broken branch, or physical trace in the mud, only to appear moments later, miles away, hovering silently near the steel spans of the river. As the months dragged on, the mystery grew deeper, expanding into a multi-layered pocket of absolute paranormal hysteria. The energetic tension in the town reached an absolute high-frequency boiling point. It wasn't just a monster in the woods anymore. The very atmosphere of the Ohio River Valley seemed to be actively tearing at the seams. UFO sightings exploded across the entire county. Dozens of independent witnesses reported seeing large, silent, glowing orbs of orange, blue, and amber light performing impossible aerial maneuvers directly over the river valley. In the dead of night, television sets in local living rooms would spontaneously turn themselves on, blasting distorted static at maximum volume. Radios hissed with phantom frequencies, and the town's mechanical telephone networks began to completely collapse under the weight of mysterious cross-connections and phantom rings. It was as if an unseen, hyper-advanced electromagnetic grid was being laid down over Point Pleasant, turning the entire geographic region into an unstable, vibrating matrix where the boundaries separating our material reality from another layer of existence were actively dissolving. Part 3. John Keel and the Psychological War. Then, the narrative took an even darker, more psychological turn as an outsider stepped into the fray. His name was John Keel. He was a seasoned, highly skeptical investigative journalist who had spent his entire career traveling the world, deconstructing illusions, exposing fraudulent mediums, and analyzing anomalous reports with a cold, rational, analytical intellect. He didn't believe in monsters, and he certainly didn't believe in ghosts. But when Keel stepped off the bus and immersed himself in the heavy, paranoid atmosphere of Point Pleasant, his rational framework completely shattered. He quickly discovered that the Mothman sightings were merely the surface layer of a much larger, infinitely more complex intelligence that was actively executing a campaign of psychological warfare against the populace. Keel embedded himself in the community, and almost immediately his own hotel room became the epicenter of an absolute technological siege. The telephone line in his room would ring at all hours of the day and night. When he picked up the receiver, he wasn't met with human voices, but with chaotic, mechanical bursts of electronic static, strange chirping sounds, and metallic, non-human cadences that sounded like a computer attempting to mimic human speech. Entities claiming to be cosmic observers, calling themselves names like Indrid Cold, began delivering long, cryptic monologues directly to Keel. These entities did not communicate in logical, straightforward human terms. Instead, they fed Keel and various local witnesses a continuous stream of fragmented data blocks, esoteric prophecies, and confusing predictions about future global events. They predicted major plane crashes across the globe, political assassinations in distant countries, and catastrophic structural failures with an unsettling, variable degree of accuracy. Keel found himself trapped in an absolute psychological hall of mirrors. The intelligence was explicitly operating with a sinister intent. It was trying to overload the human analytical engine. By feeding the human researchers just enough accurate information to win their absolute, unyielding trust, and then completely confounding them with contradictory data, the unseen forces were deliberately inducing a state of total cognitive breakdown, forcing them to question the very nature of their own sanity. But the phone calls were just the beginning of the psychological invasion. The mystery spilled out of the wires and onto the rural streets as anomalous entities began appearing physically in the county, operating in the open shadow of the valley. Witnesses who chose to speak publicly about their encounters with the Mothman, or who shared the strange messages they were receiving, were systematically tracked, monitored, and visited by bizarre, deeply unsettling individuals who became known as the Men in Black. These figures drove pristine, completely spotless, outdated 1940s style black cars that moved silently through the rural roads. Vehicles that locals noted smelled strongly of ozone, sulfur, and old plastic. The men wore identical sharp black suits with crisp white shirts and black ties, looking completely out of place in a rural West Virginia town. But it was their physical biology that truly terrified the people they visited. Their movements were completely mechanical, rigid, and unhuman, as if they were puppets being awkwardly controlled by an external operator. They spoke in flat, robotic, sing-song vocal cadences, frequently exhibiting a total shocking confusion regarding basic human customs. During interviews, they would stare blankly at simple everyday objects like ballpoint pens or eating utensils with absolute incomprehension, as if they were looking at alien artifacts from another dimension. They delivered cryptic, chilling warnings to the townspeople, demanding absolute, unyielding silence regarding the anomalies in Point Pleasant before stepping back into their pristine black cars and vanishing into the darkness. Part 4. The Shared Nightmare. As the calendar pages flipped toward the final weeks of late 1967, the psychological pressure within the town reached an absolute suffocating crescendo. The universe had stopped sending cryptic phone calls. Instead, it began screaming a collective, terrifying warning directly into the subconscious minds of the population, completely bypassing their conscious intellect. It was no longer just an isolated eccentric having a bad dream. An entire cross-section of the population, people who had never met, who worked different jobs and lived in different neighborhoods, began waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in freezing sweat, gasping for air, clutching their chests in absolute, unexplainable terror. The details of these shared nightmares were horrifyingly uniform. A massive block of psychological data being projected into the local collective consciousness. People saw burning metal twisting violently in the dark. They heard the agonizing, muffled screams of loved ones drowning in pitch-black, icy water. They saw children's toys, tattered winter coats, and colorful holiday decorations floating helplessly down a cold river current. Mary Heyer, the dedicated local journalist who had spent the last 13 months calmly and professionally documenting the town's anomalies for the local newspaper, found herself completely incapacitated by the sheer intensity of these psychological projections. Every single time she closed her eyes to rest, her mind was hijacked by a vivid, recurring nightly vision. She saw a dark, turbulent body of water choked with tangled steel, crushed cars, and countless brightly colored, wrapped Christmas packages bobbing on the freezing surface. She did not know what it meant. She could not comprehend the terrible, crushing weight of the prophecy she was carrying in her mind. The entire town of Point Pleasant was resting on top of a massive, invisible, metaphysical pressure cooker. completely blind to the fact that the spatial and temporal coordinates of their daily life were actively converging on a point of absolute catastrophic destruction. Part 5. The Silver Bridge Collapse. That brings our narrative to the fateful afternoon of December 15th, 1967. It was a freezing, bitter, grey winter evening, just 10 days before Christmas. The festive holiday lights of Point Pleasant were shining brightly across the streets, creating a stark contrast against the dark, heavy storm clouds rolling over the valley. The town's primary artery, its vital connection to the outside world, was the massive, gleaming Silver Bridge. Built in 1928, the Silver Bridge was celebrated as an absolute triumph of modern American engineering. It was heralded as a structural masterpiece because it utilized an advanced, specialized eye-bar suspension system, massive heat-treated carbon steel links, rather than standard redundant wire cables. This gave the bridge an elegant, minimalist, hyper-modern profile that looked incredibly strong. On this specific evening, at exactly 5 p.m., the bridge was completely gridlocked, packed bumper to bumper with heavy, slow-moving holiday traffic. Parents were driving home from work, tired but eager to start the weekend. Children were laughing in the back seats of sedans, pointing out the window at the river, surrounded by those exact, colourful, wrapped Christmas packages Mary Hire had seen in her nightmares. Massive, heavily loaded commercial semi-trucks idled on the narrow lanes, their diesel engines sending deep vibrations through the structure. The air was thick with exhaust fumes, the smell of winter air, and the cheerful sounds of holiday music playing on dozens of car radios. Everyone on that bridge operated under the comfortable, hard-wired psychological assumption that the massive steel towers and heavy iron links, holding them hundreds of feet above the black abyss of the Ohio River, were completely immortal. They trusted their lives and the lives of their children to decisions made by engineering committees and corporate contractors decades before they were even born. They were entirely blind to the brutal physical truth that everything in this material universe is actively decaying. They had no idea that deep within eye-bar number 330, located on the Ohio side of the suspension chain, a silent, invisible nightmare had been slowly maturing in absolute darkness for nearly 40 years. This design possessed an absolute fatal flaw. It had zero structural redundancy. If a single eye-bar link failed, the entire suspension network would experience an uncontainable, instantaneous chain reaction of stress redistribution. Under the persistent rhythmic pounding of decades of daily traffic, a microscopic flaw, a tiny cleavage fracture measuring a mere 0.1 inches, had been quietly widening. Molecule by molecule, waiting for the perfect convergence of weight, freezing winter temperature, and kinetic stress to trigger an absolute catastrophe. Suddenly, at exactly 5:04 p.m., a loud, terrifying sound echoed across the river valley, a sharp, violent crack that sounded like a massive artillery shell firing in the dark. In an absolute fraction of a second, eye-bar 330 snapped. The physical matrix of the bridge could no longer bear the weight. Within a matter of seconds, the entire Silver Bridge began to violently twist, groan, and fold into the river like a fragile house of cards. The massive steel towers snapped at their bases, the heavy iron links tore apart with agonizing shrieks of metal, and dozens of vehicles were plunged headfirst into the pitch-black, freezing, turbulent currents of the Ohio River. 46 human lives vanished beneath the icy waters in a single breath. The bridge didn't just fall, it was violently torn from its foundations, twisted into scrap metal and dragged into the abyss, instantly extinguishing the hopes, dreams and futures of dozens of local families. Part 6. The Silence. As emergency vehicles, heavy cranes and military recovery units rushed to the banks of the river, flashing their piercing red strobes into the freezing winter darkness, an absolute scene of devastation emerged. For weeks, rescue divers braved the zero-visibility, ice-choked currents, risking their own lives as they searched through a tangled, razor-sharp maze of underwater steel to recover the bodies of the victims. And as they pulled the wreckage from the black depths, they uncovered a reality that mirrored Mary Hyre's nightmares with absolute, flawless, terrifying precision. The river was choked with the crushed, twisted hulls of family cars, shattered steel beams, and dozens of floating, waterlogged Christmas gifts that had been lovingly packed for holiday celebrations that would never happen. While the official government forensic investigation eventually concluded its work by identifying the physical cracked piece of steel, a discovery that shocked the nation and forced the United States Congress to officially implement the 1968 National Bridge Inspection Standards to monitor the country's aging, neglected infrastructure. The true esoteric secrets of Point Pleasant were left completely unaddressed by any mainstream agency. Because the exact moment the Silver Bridge fell into the icy river, a definitive, eerie, absolute silence settled over the entire county. The strange mechanical phone calls abruptly stopped. The glowing orbs of orange light vanished from the night skies. The men in black abandoned their surveillance posts, packed up their pristine black cars, and slipped back into the shadows of the unknown. And the Mothman was never seen in Point Pleasant again. This total, immediate cessation of all anomalous activity provided the ultimate chilling revelation to independent researchers. The creature, the sightings, the prophecies, and the psychological terror were not random, disconnected events. They were structurally, mathematically bound to the tragedy itself. It was a trans-dimensional warning system projected by a cosmic intelligence that operates completely outside of our linear perception of time. An intelligence to which the collapse of the Silver Bridge was not an event hidden in the future, but a static, burning monument in space-time that it was actively reacting to. The creature didn't leave because its mission was finished. It left because the timeline had finally caught up with the catastrophe, closing the temporal loop forever. The haunting story of the Silver Bridge stands as an eternal reminder that beneath the solid, comfortable structures of our rational modern world lies a hidden universe of terrifying secrets. And whenever we build monuments to our own technical arrogance, ignoring the silent rot within our systems, something ancient, winged and red-eyed will always be waiting in the shadows to watch it burn. Part 7. The Architecture of True Mastery. Let us expand our narrative horizon for a moment and look at how this exact psychological framework applies to your own journey toward absolute mental and language development. To truly master a complex structure, whether it is a massive steel suspension bridge or the deep, intricate architecture of a foreign language. You must train your mind to look past the superficial surface data and track the underlying currents. Just as a forensic engineer looks at a collapsed bridge and visualizes the invisible lines of stress and structural fatigue running through the metal, you must look at human language and visualize the deep psychological and contextual patterns that drive authentic communication. You cannot achieve true mastery by treating a language like a dry math problem, memorizing vocabulary lists and rigid grammar formulas out of a textbook. That mechanical approach builds a fragile structure with zero redundancy, destined to collapse the moment you experience the heavy traffic of real-world native conversation. When you listen to a dark, complex narrative like the one we have just unfolded, your brain is performing an incredible subconscious act of pattern matching and contextual reconstruction. If you are constantly pausing the audio, over-analyzing individual words, or relying on translated text bridges, you are violently fracturing your cognitive continuity. You are forcing your brain to operate as a slow, clunky, mechanical translator rather than a rapid, fluid language processor. You must possess the confidence to allow the words to flow over your consciousness like a continuous, unyielding stream, trusting your subconscious neural networks to naturally organize the details and construct the mental images. This direct sensory engagement is what builds authentic fluency, transforming your mind into an active participant in the story. Think deeply about how a native speaker experiences a story. They do not hear individual phonetic blocks or translate dictionary definitions in their head. They see a movie unfolding within their imagination. When I say the words, freezing December evening, the native mind does not decode the grammar. It instantly triggers a physical sensation of coldness, a visual picture of grey, heavy skies, and an emotional feeling of winter isolation. Your ultimate objective in your language training is to build these identical, direct sensory connections, stripping away the slow academic middle layers and allowing the audio to connect directly to your biology. To accelerate this transformation, implement the advanced auditory tracking framework every single day without fail. Dedicate 15 focused minutes to listening to deep, high-intensity narratives without any subtitles or textual assistance, forcing your pattern-matching brain to decode natural speech through rich visual cues and situational context. Combine this input with the physical practice of the speak-back method, loudly and passionately mimicking native speakers to activate your mirror neurons and build permanent muscle memory for pronunciation and rhythm. Value small, unyielding daily consistency over massive, irregular bursts of intensity, signaling to your biology that this data is vital for your daily survival. The blueprints for transformation have been delivered to your hands, the tools are fully prepared, and the journey to absolute, effortless mastery is now entirely yours to execute. Maintain your daily focus, trust your magnificent biological design, and let your voice command the space. Step forward into the light of true fluency. Keep your eyes open and question everything.